Today, we will start to touch upon a very interesting field, occultism. However, before we formally enter the entire occult system, I think we need to discuss some issues first. The most important one is what occultism is, and this will also become the main topic of our video. What is occultism? This question is quite difficult to answer. We can even say that this question cannot be answered in the current humanistic context and within the scope of literature we can collect. It is interesting to say this makes occultism even more mysterious. However, although this question cannot be answered, and although we, including those famous scholars, cannot systematically explain what kind of knowledge occultism is, we can learn another fact through a large number of literature. That is, occultism is untestable. This also means one thing, that occultism does not have standard terminology concepts, and it is particularly similar to the early field of psychology. It is roughly that different scholars and experts use nouns or terms to explain concepts for different goals and discussions. These terms and nouns often imply very different meanings. Unfortunately, psychology has basically unified the meaning of terms through the academic behavior of a group of psychiatrists such as new psychology and behavioral psychology, which are similar to revolutions. But so far, there has been no large-scale academic movement in the field of occultism. So we really want to get into touch with the field of occultism and read the literature about it obsessively, we will fall into another unspeakable passivity. We must switch back and forth to accept this knowledge. It is not because of anything else, but because the literature surrounding occultism is expressed in historical text templates, some in literary text templates, some in the theology and in religion, and some in social, anthropological, and even in philosophical text templates. This means that it is difficult for us to compromise, judge, or clarify what kind of knowledge occultism is. Because if we are too good at a certain field, such as we have a certain degree of understanding and knowledge of history, then it is very likely that we will not be able to accept the live information delivered to us by literature or religious text templates. Some people will emphasize this point. That is, the subjects we just mentioned seem to be related together. The subtitle point is that it is not difficult to connect these subjects with our existing knowledge. But if we connect occultism with them, things will become illusory. The simplest example is that when we observe and understand the context of occultism from a historical perspective, we always look at it from the perspective of natural science and think that the things that happened in history are related to occultism. The context is just a phenomena under the humanistic background in a certain historical context. We will think that occultism is the method used by people at the time to solve unknown phenomena. Similarly, when we look at occultism from perspective of social anthropology, we will think that occultism is just a trick used by humans in group activities. That is, a trick used to adjust relationships in society. Occultism has become a lubricant and placebo in the lives of human groups. Or when we look at occultism from the perspective of theology or religion, it becomes an unknown and unknowable scandalous. It not only represents God, but also proves that God is everywhere and that His power is manifesting. In this way, occultism seems to be changeable in different cultural environments, or should we say, when we observe it from different knowledge and cultural perspectives and angles, its image is completely different. The reason for this result is that, as we have just mentioned, the literature on occultism that we can collect is very limited and full of limitations. For this reason, I also constituted a friend of mine who has a deep understanding of occultism. Before making this video, in order not to make a big mistake, I visited specifically. It dispelled my concerns with one sentence. His original words were that many occult literature, especially those that are religious or literary text templates, actually read like game settings. In this regard, he also gave me 5 to 6 books for reference and research. The first book I opened was called Paper Scriptures of Western Mysticism. I soon discovered that this was a typical book to look at mysticism from a historical perspective. Then I opened books on mysticism research, witchcraft, sorcery and magic, English folk beliefs, etc. Finally, at about 1 a.m., my friend and I came to almost some conclusion. That is, if we look at mysticism from a neutral perspective, we can describe it as a setting level. However, such conclusions that are dear are enough for us to reflect or ask questions, and this reflective emotion will also become our entry point for the question of what is mysticism. First of all, we have to divide the history of mysticism or its growth into 3 different stages. The first stage is the basic span in the longest time, from ancient Greece to the Middle Ages, until the Enlightenment in the 17th century. The second stage occurred in the 1960s and 1970s. And the third stage is our current 21st century. Let's look at the first stage first. In this stage, the content that we cannot ignore is Hebraistic, Napoleonistic, and Jewish mystics. Among them, Jewish mystic is the easiest to understand from our contemporary perspective. It is actually a kind of religious mysticism. Naturally, it is inseparable from only divine power. The ultimate it emphasizes is divine power, and the theory of simplism supports Jewish mysticism. We can also say that the two of them are intertwined and connected. The Paleonism belongs to the category of philosophy and theology. We can understand that people think about the nature of the world, the nature of man and the nature of soul through philosophical thinking. But we need to pay attention to the fact that although simplism and Jewish mysticism are intertwined in the field of mysticism, it should be said that it is more Jewish mysticism. Simplism borrows and takes a lot of thoughts, but the two are actually hostile to each other at the root. The biggest reason is that simplism does not exclude polytheism. Regarding Napoleonism and Jewish fancism, I think we'll open a program to talk about it in the future. There are some things about magic. The main topic, the two of them, is too big. There are many philosophical contents in it, and it is not so closely related to our main topic today, so we will temporarily stop today. As a result, our focus today is Hermeticism. Gamers should be familiar with the Hermetic Assassin's Creed. There was a secret code that adhered to the Hermetic philosophy in the video game, right? And why is Hermeticism so important? Because it is most consistent with the symbolism between occultism, or it can be best represented, occultism. It is different from the two we just mentioned. Hermeticism happens to be between the two. In other words, Hermeticism not only recognizes the existence of an omniscient and omnipotent God, but also believes that this omniscient and omnipotent God participate in the creation and operation of the world we live in. In simple terms, the world is a huge living body. It not only has life, but also creates everything. The appearance of all things is accidental. Accidental emergencies are not like religion, so they are generally deliberate, nor are they inevitably result, but rather sudden situations. I think everyone will find one thing, that is, the argument of Hermeticism is actually very close to the argument of quantum physics. But quantum physics is observed and understood from a scientific perspective, while Hermeticism emphasizes perception, that is, the induction ability of personal spiritual knowledge. Hermeticism believes that the amount of gendanoma that people can carry varies. In other words, people are like vessels that can be filled with the so-called secret knowledge. Some people are born with a smaller vessel capacity, while others are larger. Those with smaller vessels often do not have a strong desire for Gendanoma, and simple or dogmatic religious behavior can satisfy their Gendanoma needs. Correspondingly, if similarly overflowing the vessel will also cause bad results, similar to a kind of madness cursed by knowledge. Therefore, people with smaller vessel capacity will not have too much desire for Gendarama in general, which is a manifestation of world harmony. And it also becomes a proof that Hermeticism emphasizes the existence of God and their participation in the world and presiding over harmony. We can probably guess that the Hermeticism must sound a little strange to us now. In fact, the main reason is that it sounds even weirder because it is said by us. However, the fact is that the context that his argument ultimately wants to advocate is actually a kind of perceptual content. If we do not recognize or understand it, it will only be a manifestation of unqualifiedness in their eyes. Let's look at the second stage, from the 1960s to the 1970s. This was an era of large-scale revival of mysticism. What was revived was neither Simplamatism nor Jewish mysticism, but precisely the Hermeticism we just talked about. Why did he revive? Mystic scholars have a view that reason kills imagination, so the poor souls held hostage by the word modern rebelled. During this period, a series of phenomena occurred in Europe and the United States, which turned from reason to romance. In fact, it was a digest change from scientific reason to mystical transcendence. From the perspective of Hermeticism, since the Enlightenment, people's desire for spiritual knowledge has not been satisfied for a long time due to the cohesion of reason. So they have a rebellious mentality and have staged many incomprehensible and absurd things. A modern British witch wrote her mystical manuscript that in order to satisfy their desire for Gandamoa lucidum, those people actually tried to establish or find a perception of the world through drugs. Yes, which was talked about LSD, a strong semi-artificial hallucinogen, a drug. Since 1963, LSD has been popular in Europe and the United States on a large scale. It was banned in 1966, but it still couldn't stop people from craving for that drug. The kind of imaginary craving, so LSD, had been openly present in Europe and American society, and it was only gradually hidden in about 7 years. Finally, let's look at the third stage, which is 21st century we are in now. To be more precise, it should be from the 1870s to the present of the 21st century. If we compare the cultural development of society with this theory of Hermeticism, we will be surprised to find that the development of society and people almost confirms the main point of this doctrine, that is, people's desire for Gandanomia lucidum. We have already had a rough introduction to the development of modern art in the previous video. We can find that if the concept of modern art is transformed into a kind of ideological comfort for the public, it will undoubtedly become a kind of Placido, similar to universal religion that is opposed to rational level, but does not conflict with it on the surface, just like the care of kitsched art for the public that we talked about before. Furthermore, literature and philosophy also reveal similar reflections. Just like the inevitable tragedy of modern society as described by psychologist Lacan, it seems that we have indeed forgotten the desire for spiritual wisdom. Among the Hermeticism under mysticism also has something called the theory of city stars. The theory of city stars believes that the city built by humans is an empty shell with any entity. Humans live in an empty shell without any entity. Naturally, they cannot perceive anything and cannot feel the power of nature. If this continues, humans will inevitably lose their souls and get lost in a lifeless, empty shell called a city. Maybe you don't understand it very well. Let me explain. Most of the time, as a modern person in the information age, the most difficult problem we encounter in the wild or in the countryside may be a bad network sign, right? Naturally, the network sign in the city must be excellent, and this theory is saying that I am in the city. We have lost the network sign with this world, so we can't receive or perceive the world that is natural self. If this continues, it will cause great harm to our hearts or souls. Some scholars have also explained this theory from a psychological perspective. For example, Jung believed that it made sense because data showed that after the expansion of cities and the concentration of modern age, people's mental health has shown a trend of regression compared with the past. Hidden mental illness and many new symptoms that are difficult to explain from a psychological perspective have also begun to emerge. At the same time, we also need to know that urban psychological emphasizes that humans have destroyed the unity of nature and torn apart the originally unified nature, just like tearing apart the originally unified body. Let me explain that his view is actually very similar to a popular, elegant culture, which is cyberpunk. It can be said that what he and cyberpunk proposed is that if we replace all parts of our body with machines, then will I still be me? Huh? The starting point of this question is exactly the same as the question, but this theory gives its own conclusion. That is, if this unity is destroyed, then I will naturally no longer be me. On this basis, a mystical clothing theory has emerged. It sounds particularly unreliable, right? But this theory is actually the same as the view of urban psychology we just mentioned. It is almost the same. He advocates that people need to pay attention to the unity of clothing when they dress. This unity is shown in the unity of temperament. This theory also integrates the magnetic field and other continents together. We will not elaborate on it here today. However, the emergence of these theories also show one thing. That is, it shows that people in modern society do have this desire. It is also under this desire that society has given people many entertainment products, and its content is more or less centered around the mystique of Hermeticism, and then piety and piety. It is just between the two, just like the gods they believed in are everywhere. This is also biologists who have been arguing about the biological clock should be the most touched. So, what is mysticism? That question cannot be answered. If I must answer, I will say that mysticism may be a study of reason and madness, beauty and ruin, nothing and everything, existence and disappearance, life and death. And this study wonderfully placed itself in the middle of them. He does not intend to observe from the bottom or worship from the top, but quietly participates in it, creates and changes something. Okay, this video ends here. I don't know what you think after listening to this episode. Welcome to Live a Message. At the same time, this episode is also a forward-looking video. Many contents have not been expanded and discussed in depth. I also want to see everyone's reaction. If everyone is interested, we can have a good chat, especially those interesting topics. I think the most interesting one is the one I just mentioned. Mysticism dressing is really philosophical and close to our lives, and it is also quite elegant and interesting. See you in the next video. Bye.